Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we are talking about head types in relationships.
Finally. It's time for us, head types, and to share a little bit of our secrets.
You've been waiting for this.
I have, but mostly people who relate with head types have been waiting for this because I know head types can be a mystery for many people.
They are indeed. Certainly to me, I'm definitely still figuring you out.
Okay. Yeah. Although I think fives are a bit more difficult than other head types. But let's see. Let's unveil some of the secrets of how to relate with head types, fives, sixes, and sevens.
Okay. So once again, to remind people of what exactly we'll be talking about with regard to head types and relationships, we'll discuss general tendencies, patterns, and traits that head types display when relating to others. Then we'll talk about things that make head types happy, that tips for getting along with the head types in your life. And then we'll talk about things that bother head types and how you can get into trouble with them. And then we'll talk about what's good about being in relationship with head types for those of us non-head types who may find them mysterious and potentially every once in a while a little bit difficult.
Sounds like a good outline for head types to have here. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So since you're the expert on head types, especially in relationship to me, or you have the inside knowledge that I lack. Why don't you start us off by listing some general tendencies, traits, patterns that you see head types expressing in relationships?
The first one is seeking for security and certainty in relationships. So I'd say that whenever the agreements, the pacts in the relationship are not clear, or when you feel that the other person is questioning what has been agreed, then that becomes difficult to handle. Head types are fear types, but fear for head types is more like intolerance for uncertainty and wishing to anticipate mentally everything that is going to happen. So there is a bigger need for head types to have agreements. And I think that sometimes people see like ones on relationships and think they are mental, but it's not about having an agreement, really. It's more about doing things right in their way. And that's not what happens with head types. It's more like head types need you to guarantee and bring them safety in what they can expect from the relationship in the short run and in the long run.
Is that why you like to create overall planning before doing things?
Yes, so connecting what you've just said with relationships, I feel a bigger need to have planning when I'm doing things with others, meaning that the planning has to do with limiting the risk of other people surprising me or doing things that will be scary.
And do you think it's that same exact way for sixes and sevens, in addition to you as a five being that way?
So I do think so because in different ways they come from the same concern and willingness. So definitely for sixes, it's similar in the sense that they need to know ahead your next steps so that they feel safer. But even for sevens, it's like that in my view, because it's more like they are full of plans of themselves. And if you don't engage with that, they're not very willing to go out of their plans. And they like your plans if they fit with their plans, or if they sound like a good idea or a better plan, but they still need a plan, you know. So you can see that head types are a lot about plans, and also try to have things under certain mental control.
That makes sense. Interesting, and not something that is on the top of my list in relationships.
Yeah.
So,
So I want to say, B, that I'm trying, and I think I've started sharing things that most head types are not going to share with you, to truly unveil mysteries and help people understand what's behind what happens in the relationship with head types. So I'm hoping that this will be useful for people in relationships with head types, but also that it won't piss off too many head types that I'm sharing too many secrets.
but it sounds like what you're saying is that these are things that while head types may do and may know about themselves, especially when they hear you say it, they may not recognize it
Yeah,
enough to share it with people
it's
at the
unconscious.
beginning stages of a relationship because they just do it so naturally.
Yeah, it's unconscious
Yeah,
for most of us. It
right.
took me some time to realize that my excessive planning with my wife and my kids and friends was coming from my own need of controlling them,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a mental type thing. We want to anticipate steps of life and people around us so that we feel more secure.
So, in addition to that need for security and certainty, and so the desire for clear agreements and planning, what else? Or maybe what's another manifestation of that need for security and certainty? What other traits can you identify that might be good for people to understand about head types and relationships?
Well, when there is that time to discuss problems in the relationship, or when there is an issue and some kind of argument happens, it's easier for head types if that doesn't go to a very emotional place that feels scary. It's like they tend to intellectualize the discussion to make sense of it and try to keep it under control so that it doesn't become something worse. And when the other person is not willing to do that, that becomes troubling and fearful for head types. So they try to bring the discussion back to comfortable territory, which is mental, understanding all that's happening. Now, if both in the relationship are mental, it can be an endless discussion. Like with my wife, as a six, she's a six, and I'm a five. It becomes a little bit like endless, and we can, at times, that's our bias, and we need to force ourselves to just be emotional or be instinctive if we want to get out of that loop.
I see. And so for the non head types, how are you? Because, of course, in relationships, emotions get stirred up,
Yeah.
and you mentioned that head types intellectualize. So that may mean that they don't, on one hand, like you said very clearly, they don't necessarily want to be talking about too many emotions or getting into emotional territory for too long a period of time. And it also sounds like what you're saying is they can intellectualize. In other words, they can avoid their emotions
Mhm.
and go to the mental in a way. So how are they when it comes to actually feeling the emotions and talking about emotions? Is it just that they have a limited tolerance for that or a limited time period? Or how does that go generally?
Most of the times, people are more fixated in ego and personality. And when that happens, and they are mental types, they think of emotions, they don't feel them directly because of the same fear of uncertainty and things that we can control. And emotions are part of that. Or think of sensations instead of directly having them. So that is what mental types will try to do with the conversation, to bring it to a more reasonable, sensible discussion that isn't just about expressing emotionality. Now, for a good idea for people in relationship with head types, one thing to do is to explain why that is not good for them. Instead of just showing and displaying that is horrible, just explain that, because you get to where you need to get with head types when they understand what the issue is. It's at the very least 50% of what you need to do to have them understand first, and then they adapt way easier. Now, when head types grow and are not as fixated in personality, they necessarily start experiencing emotions more directly and sensations more directly. And then it's good to give them feedback that that's a good thing, because I believe head types at times get negative feedback when that happens, unfortunately. It's like, you used to be so rational or so calm or whatever, and now I don't see you being like that.
Mhm.
So don't do that with a head type, because that's evolution for them.
Right, right. Understand that at a certain point they may be more emotional, and that's a good thing. So, what other traits and tendencies would you think are important for people to understand?
um, Relationships become better when they feel mentally challenged and intellectually stimulated. It's more like having discussions that are nice and deep, like over a dinner table, or about life, about things, or about the relationship, and going deeper in some aspects, or just brainstorming and having ideas of plans of what to do, and being a bit adventurous, because although sevens are the most adventurous usually of the three head types, mental energy has to do with adventure, has to do with curiosity, has to do with going out of the box. This is why head types um, usually don't see only black and white. They see all shades of gray, and they don't like to repeat things as much. They don't want only routines and things that are not, you know are not creative. I think there is a tendency for some extra creativity. I mean, the mental creativity for head types, because they want to be mentally stimulated and go for things that are new, from a perspective of feeling curious. So if the other person offers that, there is a potential for a positive impact in the relationship.
Offers what exactly?
The possibility of being okay with their curiosity, not pushing against it, and being curious themselves. I'd say that the other person gets more attractive for head types when they display that curiosity themselves.
I think we're already getting into things that make head types happy.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else to describe sort of in terms of a general tendency before we go there,
Mm.
or have we covered it?
It's important to be understanding and non-judgmental with the fact that head types might feel cold at times, for if you are a more sensitive person, or that they feel like they don't move on if you're an instinctive person. It's important to be sensitive, because it's really something to be seen as a skill that they haven't yet developed as much as you have. So be understanding of that, and go a bit slowly with them, especially when giving feedback about that, and explain why that can be good for them. And then I'll ask them to get your help in helping them be this way, because out of curiosity they will be okay with that. But just don't push too much. Just don't, pressure is difficult for head types there is a whole insecurity about moving on if you don't have certainty.
Mm.
So it's good to wait a bit, and at the same time to offer support. Now, the understanding I'm talking about is not exactly an emotional holding. It's more like, I hear you and I won't press, and I understand you, and I think that with calmness from my part, I can help you venture out and do things, sometimes without being sure about them, explore, and I think you'll be excited and curious about all of that. And even for sevens, I do think this is the case, because it's way easier for sevens to do that when they are in charge of what they're choosing.
When you talk about safety and security and certainty, is there at the core of that kind of a fear of the unknown?
Yes,
I see.
yes. It, mental types have a very basic thing of wanting to know it all. It's not only fives. It's wanting to know everything, to control all of them. So this is the way that supposedly unconsciously I try to feel safe about living life. So yes,
So, what are some of the things that make head types happy?
that exchange of curiosity, some adventure, some kind of um, structure at the same time. So it's sometimes difficult to grasp, um, mix of structure and breaking out of the box and creating. So it's something that, somewhere in between these two things you'll find success with head types in relationships. And another thing that makes head types happy, in my view, as a head type myself, is the opportunity to learn things together. And when the other person uh, wants to go for knowledge and a better understanding of life in general, if that doesn't exist, the bonding isn't as easy.
Mm.
So if the other person doesn't show interest for true mental development and enriching mental exchanges, things become more difficult in the relationship.
Like, what makes a head type happy is intellectual curiosity, or being met in terms of liking to think about things and think creatively,
Hmm.
and maybe make plans from a point of view of allowing for creativity, like we said, brainstorming or coming up with new ideas.
Yeah, yes, it's all of this, but I think that also includes the kind of movie we're going to watch tonight.
Mhm.
It's like, if it adds to my mental processes, it's more fun. So it's not as easy for mental types, as I listen from many people about this, to just not feel stimulated in the head. It's really head and mental stimulation. I can't use another word, I think. If the relationship is a means towards that,
Mhm.
then they are happy. And if it's not, there is this beginning of disconnection in the
Mhm.
relationship, because unconsciously, and I know this won't sound really nice, but it's what happens, and all of us have biases and shadows. Unconsciously, I believe that head types use everything and people around them as means to develop mentally. And it's a little bit of a functional view of people and things in life to help them exercise their thoughts.
You mentioned earlier that head types like it when you explain something a lot. So it sounds like especially maybe around a conflict or around an emotional interaction, it might be good for the head type if, again, those of us who aren't head types tried to go to more to the mental level and explain what we're even what we're feeling more in mental terms.
Yeah, I think a more generic way I would use to try to explain this is that all three mental types do not like bad surprises or to get caught in a situation that the other sounds or feels impulsive or having a burst of any kind of reaction that you had not anticipated. So that can happen with emotional emotions, with anger, with that comes from also body types, or anything that you had not mapped out previously. So any reaction that feels abrupt is a bit difficult to deal with. And this is why if the person in relationship with the head type learns a little bit to calm down first and communicate a bit more with logic and with some reason, and then talk a little bit about the feeling and eventually also display that later, then it becomes way more comfortable for head types and they may respond better to you.
Yeah, I know as a heart type, I've always been sensitive to the bias that I think we have in many cultures, especially Western culture, certainly US culture, of how rational
Mhm.
being rational is better than being irrational. Irrational being you're being irrational can be an insult or a criticism. Whereas I always say feelings, emotions by definition are irrational.
Yeah.
Thoughts and mental activity is rational. So saying that, just saying, okay, we both need to be open to both, it does sound like it's really important for us, and I would say especially heart types, to learn to be able to communicate in a rational way, especially when you're communicating around points of difficulty or when you are emotional. Like I know for me, I'm still learning. I've been learning, but I still forget on a regular basis that when I'm having a strong emotion, like in our relationship, I really need to kind of back up and process it myself first, maybe vent it out, maybe take a walk, maybe be with that for a while before I attempt to communicate. Because if I communicate when I'm in the heat of that emotion, it is hard for me to base what I'm saying on logic or, it's hard for me to be mental in a ongoing way. I'm driven by that emotion, and I know that can create confusion or problems of different kinds. And so it sounds like what makes the head type happy is if those of us, and I'm not sure how this would be for body based types, but if at least for those of us that are heart types, and maybe body types too, if we consciously make an effort to meet you on that mental level,
Yeah.
to phrase things in terms of concepts, ideas, and what about like data? I guess different people can
Mm.
interpret data differently, and certainly emotional data might
Mm.
might be called data, but may not be logical. So logic, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So let me report back to you how I heard the things that you've just said.
Okay.
First, I liked a lot your understanding that it's good for non-head types to try to do more of what you said they can do. I really like that because, and I'm trying just to see the immediate reaction I have because honestly, I do it a bit differently right now in my life. I get more emotional directly or instinctive myself, but I'm talking from a perspective of our first reaction here. So I appreciated that because you showed to me the capacity of self control and logic and understanding where I come from. It's not as much. a feeling of being met, being heard, or being understood in a personal level. It's just that there is an easier way to trust someone else who gets to a logical conclusion.
And what you just said is important because even those words you used, being met, being heard, being understood,
Yeah,
those of the people who have heard the heart type
yeah,
in relation heart types in relationship episode might remember that those are important words for us heart types. Like
yeah.
for me, I have a continual fear of being misunderstood, which is why I've noticed I have a pattern of repeating myself
Yeah.
when I speak. And you've often said, as a head type, just it bothers you if I repeat myself. And maybe that's a five thing, or maybe it's all the head types. But I need to work on that because I've recognized that in myself, and I know it's about a fear of being misunderstood, and it's
Uh,
almost like I'm circling around in my own head, a little bit driven by my emotions.
mhm.
And it's almost like I'll say the same thing in slightly different words, or even almost the same words, because there's this sense that I have to repeat myself a few times to actually be understood. But I don't necessarily think that's true,
Mhm.
especially from a head type point of view, because you heard me say it the first time, and if it was, especially if it was rational and logical, you got it.
Yeah. So, yeah, so going on with my feedback, what you said again, what you said now, as an addition to what you said before, also made me feel really good because you're making an effort to understand your process and not only manage it out of a lack of a good assessment of it, which is what for head types feels like others are not doing in general in life. They're not thinking. So and we do have some prejudice that we need to work on ourselves when we don't feel that others are doing, as if reasoning is more important than other processes in life. Now, another feedback piece for you from what you said is that when you described how hard types are unfavored in society in a few ways, I got, yeah, that makes sense. And in my head, I started opening up space immediately to be able to uh, allow for more direct emotions being manifested because it made sense. But if you come to me and say, look, I have a big personal need for that, and it's me. And so when things become too personal, it's harder to open up that space inside. So if you want to make things happen with head types, be logical, explain things, and come together to a common conclusion about a more general situation than what's happening right now.
Oh,
It's more,
yes.
more,
Generalizable.
yes, yeah, and
Generalizable and theoretical,
yeah,
potentially, instead of personal.
yeah. So this is all good feedback. I hope you hear this, but at the same time, I want to bring a topic for discussion. While I think that life, society in general, has actually been based in something more mental, and that wasn't fair with heart types and above all body types, because we've been talking about emotional intelligence for a few decades now, but not yet as much about instinct. But so I agree that it's not fair, and we all need to be more prone to being emotional and instinctive, not only mental. However, my point is, I don't think this is the reality of most relationships. I think that, especially for our Enneagram 2.0 listeners, chances are that relationships are an easier territory for hard types. We talk all the time about the need to be met, to be seen, to be understood, and all the protocol of how to relate with other people tends to respect a bit more emotions in us. I think for the last decades, this grew way big, you know? And I don't think it's favorable right now for head types because it's not actually the language and the core needs they have in those relationships. So while I agree that with what you said for living life in general, I'm not sure I agree that much for relationships themselves. I think that relationship aesthetics have been made a bit more complicated for head types lately.
In what way exactly?
It's like all the books and teachers talk about the need for empathy, emotional exchange, and a kind of understanding that respects emotions. And even what is considered polite in terms of um, um, what to do and what not to do in relationships, and what I call the relationship aesthetics, tries to respect each person's individuality and a lot of the emotions that can happen if you don't act a certain way. But that's not exactly head type territory. I think that head types need something else. They tend not to make things as personal, as one example. And they need to exchange ideas a bit more freely. And they need people not to take things too personally. So it feels to me that today's trends for how to do relationships don't favor head types. So while I think that in society as a whole, it's true that mental types still reign and dominate, you know
Because of our
what?
education
Yeah,
system, because of this idea that
yeah,
being irrational or illogical is
yes.
bad. Yeah,
So I agree that that's a problem.
yeah,
It's too good for head types and not as good for non head types. But I think that the new thing that is seen as necessary for relationships is the opposite. So it's not as easy for head types.
yes. I get your point, and I hear you. And it feels a little bit like the playing field is a little more leveled, like, okay, let's focus more on
Yeah.
the value of emotions and on relating, because we haven't really valued that as much
Yes.
in the
Yes.
past. It's like that's been more emphasized, and rightly so. But I get your point that it's not the comfort zone necessarily or the focus. And I especially think you're clear when you're saying that head types, because they operate more at this level of the intellect and logic, it's like you said, they don't take things as personally. Like as a two, especially sometimes when I first hear you say that, like it almost doesn't compute. It's like, well, how could you not take things personally in a relationship? However, I think you're making an important point, which is that the way head types operate in more of this theoretical intellectual level, they automatically kind of dial down the personal and go to this more conceptual theoretical level. And that's why I liked how you were helping me see that there's a way to talk about something. It's more at the level of generalizability, like
Yes.
people do this, like
Yeah.
this tends to be this way out there in culture, society, as opposed to, you know, I notice you're this way and it hurts my feelings.
Yeah. So B, I had to try to back up my head type friends who are listeners of the podcast. I'm sorry, guys, that I didn't make it as much, but I tried. So the thing is, when it comes to relationships, B, it's more difficult for head types,
I see.
fives, sixes, and sevens.
Mhm.
It's almost intrinsically something more difficult.
Yes, yes. Like I'm thinking about how when I use the Enneagram with teens, let's say, one of the things I look at is the team map. And how many types do you have in the body center, how many types in the head center, and how many types in the heart center. And I often say, like in a work setting, the heart types tend to pay more attention to the people and the relationships. The head types, and at work, especially in many work environments, it kind of makes sense that you wouldn't necessarily be seeing the relationships as the main thing that you're paying attention to. Like if you're an engineer, or whatever work you may do, there the task aspects, the mental analysis, planning aspects would make more sense. So what else makes head types really happy? Like if people out there really want to go be with their head type partners and friends tonight and really make them feel good, what kind of thing can they do or say?
Mm. I think that reinventing the relationship constantly is also a good idea. While we say that a lot for sevens, I do think that part of it is a mental type component that needs to be taken into account by the partners of head types. There is this endless seek for learning and the curiosity.
Endless
Uh,
search for learning.
yeah,
Mhm. Learning new
it's
things,
yeah, and
thinking
doing
about
new
new things,
things.
doing new things.
Yeah, I think that leads to a willingness to have relationships open up the field for that. So if the relationship does not go against that, it's already a good thing, because many times it does. When people are averse to changes, but also if people bored with you in those new experiences and explorations, that creates a bigger bonding. So I think that's something that makes head types happy.
Hi. If you're enjoying the depth of knowledge offered in this podcast, you might want to stay in touch with us. Be and Uranio offer professional Enneagram training, personal development courses, self-guided online courses, and they even have a membership platform with over 100 hours of content. Head to cpenneagram.com/podcast to learn more.
So, what kinds of things bother head types? How can you get into trouble with head types? We've probably already alluded to some of this, but to make it even more specific.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that we said it indirectly, but I'll say it again. An unwillingness to be logical in decisions, things that are said or not said in a conversation. I think that bothers head types. Another thing that, and even head types that say they're not looking for logic, I think they sometimes don't know what they're talking about, because logical people are not necessarily lacking enthusiasm and adventure or something out of the box, because it can be logical to do that, so I think that all head types, when they are coming from that head dominance in the level of awareness that is not the most advanced, I think all of them come from a willingness to see logic in the relationship. And another thing that I would say is again about emotions and instincts. When they are contextualized, when they are also explained, and when the person does not make all that's happening about them. It's like to ponder more about things, and to be able to walk on a middle path, that nothing is completely absolute. Things are a bit more relative. I do think that this is something that comes from the head energy.
It's funny when you said making it all about you, and I'm realizing in this conversation I keep making it about the heart types.
But I think you should, because it's hard for heart types to understand head types.
It's
But
true, but I also
yeah.
want to give some equal time to the body types, and
Mm,
I want to ask. I know that sometimes we talk about.
yes.
I think in all the body types, it's probably clearest. I guess in all of them, the way body types can have a sense of what the right thing to do is, but
Yes.
it's not always something they can explain. Can you give
Uh-huh.
some tips to body types that might be in relationship with head types that may just have an impulse or want to go in a certain direction or want to experience something, but it's hard to put into words that makes logical sense?
Yes. So body types, eights, nines, and ones, feel many times impatient to head types. And I include nines in here, although nines are not typically people that make others feel like they are impatient with them. I know in nines better, as you and I do. We know that there is impatience in the inside and it's getting accumulated, but they don't show it,
Right.
right? So there is an impatience because of this tendency to go do things while they think. And that is a hard concept for a head type to take in, to think while you do. There is an order of factors for head types. It's thinking and then doing. So that impatience doesn't feel good at times or many times. Another thing is that sometimes relating with body types, I feel like I'm trying hard to tell the person what I'm seeing is happening, and I'm coming up with good reasoning, and I'm saying things that make sense, and they're just looking at me, thinking like, this guy talks a lot, and he is trying to make sense of something that my belly is telling me that is simply wrong, and that could be done in that better way. So that is difficult in the
Mhm.
relationship with body types.
Mhm.
So what I think head types expect the most from body types, eights, nines, and ones, is that when they are doing the relationship with head types, that they open up space in their heads to not stay stuck in the belief that there is one right way.
Mm.
And that doesn't happen when the body type is not doing their work.
Right. And I know sixes, especially, are known for their capacity to argue different sides of one thing. And I'm sure all head types have that mental facility of, they could argue different angles on one issue, and aren't so much glued to one sense of it being right. I think that's a big difference, for instance,
Yes.
between fives and ones, even though they can look similar.
Yeah.
Fives don't think there's one right way. They
Yes.
can come up with many mental possibilities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you got it. You helped translate what I was trying to say. And by the way, in a relationship, you help a head type when you allow them to come to a simpler explanation of what they are trying to explain you, like a translation, um, but following what they are coming up with. And if you just follow what I sometimes call their mental trips,
Mm.
uh, a little bit with curiosity and attention, and then you help them become a bit more practical, concrete, or simple, that is helpful.
Right. But going back to how people might, inadvertently and intentionally get into trouble with their head type friends
Mm-hmm.
and partners and family members, um, what else would you say is kind of a potential point of conflict, or something where, again, if you're just coming from a whole different center, you may, you know, cause a problem without
Right.
meaning to?
I think that when people resist making plans and they just want to go leave, see what's going to happen, that is not comfortable for head types. And when um, without logic, people don't make decisions that make sense to be made, or when they want to make decisions without taking into account all the logical process. So basically, when people do not allow the head type to do their things, planning, analyzing, and they try to go against that, and changes that come out of the blue,
Hmm.
um,
Bad
from the
surprises.
bad surprises. Yeah, isn't it
My
interesting that
five friend always says she doesn't like surprises.
yeah, it's interesting that we think that things that come out of the blue from the other person are bad surprises, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's how we tend to feel they are.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps one last thing is when people um, want to just uh, talk about things that don't seem to add much to what I know or to what I want to experience in my mental process, like having talks that are shallow or talks that um, don't seem very grounded in a good mental perspective of life. So that is very disappointing for
I-
all head
I'm
types.
imagining it's really hard for a head type when, say, let's say their partner is a emotional type and argues from emotion and kind of refuses to be logical, or
Yeah,
doesn't doesn't see the value of logic.
yeah, and I do think that what I'm saying now is more valid for fives, but I think to a degree it's all head types. It's also be don't waste my time in terms of talking things that are not mentally meaningful. So talking about the weather or things that are shallow from our perspective, and we are not really learning anything. So again, it's I'm talking a lot as a five here, but I do think that to an extent it's for all head types that people should offer that in the relationship.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I know that you as a five have told me many times you don't like talking about something we've talked about before.
Yeah,
Like, and I know sevens also like novelty,
yeah,
that want to be sort of thinking of something new,
yeah.
doing something new,
Creating.
moving on from something you've already discussed.
And sixes that I know in my life are the same way.
Mhm.
There needs to be mental challenges and a mental quest for more.
One thing that you've taught me about head types that I really didn't know is how many thoughts the head types have, like in a short span of time. Like I remember when the first time you said this in a retreat, you demonstrated it by talking about how the day before I had told you something, and in the space of me telling you something that took maybe a minute or less to tell you, you named like 20 or 30 things that you thought of that were sparked by what I said, but all the different thoughts that you went off on,
Yeah.
sparked by what I said. And I remember my first reaction was, he never listens to me. No wonder he never listens to me. He's off in his own,
uh,
mental trips, different directions based
right.
on what I said. And we laughed about that, of course. But I think I do get the sense sometimes, and I'm thinking about some seven friends and also some six friends I have, that they're very quick,
Hmm.
that they
Yeah.
think much faster than I do.
Yeah, but I do think that everybody has this capacity if they decide to be mental in a certain moment. It's not only five, sixes, and sevens that have that. And what I see is that non-head types in relationships, when they allow for a little bit more of that, just exchanging ideas that aren't sometimes practical or whatever, but for the sake of exercising the head, that is super attractive for the head types.
That's a good point, because I do think that even in some of the things we're saying here, there's a danger of having this sense that, based on what center we are, we're kind of trapped in our way
Yeah,
of functioning.
yeah,
And I do think we really want to emphasize, and hopefully
yes,
that's what we're saying when we can learn about like how you can get in trouble with a head type, or how you can make them happy. I guess I want to emphasize that the point of talking about this is that we can be more flexible
hmm
than we often think we can. It only takes a kind of intention and
yeah,
the will to be more actively conscious in our
yes,
relationships.
yes.
And
And it
so,
can be for a short period of time that will satisfy the head type already, you
yeah,
know. And then you can invite the head type in your life to do something different with you, not in that style, you know. So it's an active effort to meet the person where the person is.
right. And I can remember recently one thing you said, and you you said that you realize that there are times when you and I are talking about emotions, and what happens for you is when it gets to a certain length of time that we're talking about the
hmm
emotions, you feel overwhelmed and you need
Yeah.
to shift. And I remember saying, well, why didn't you tell me? And you said, well, I'm just kind of getting clear on this,
Yes.
that I think before you would feel overwhelmed and
Yeah.
maybe shut down or withdraw or get mad at me. And I don't really know what's happening because I'm doing my heart type thing, and I could talk about emotions all day, and often have as a psychotherapist. But that really helped me, because when you said that, I said, well, all you really have to do is tell me
hmm
that you kind of reached your limit, or that you're feeling overwhelmed, and can we get more mental? Because I was raised in an environment where education was valued. Of course, I think
Yeah.
we teach the head, so I can be very heady,
hmm
but it's not my default. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I really said, I was very clear in saying, look, just tell me, and I'm happy
hmm
to meet you in the mental space,
Yes.
just like I really appreciate you, how much you meet me in the emotional place. And one thing I've learned about you is there have been times when we had a conflict and you accused me of being too emotional, and I was able to say, hey, I think your emotions were just as problematic as mine were, because
Yeah.
you are someone getting in touch with your emotions.
Yes.
and i
Yes.
think and i think just like me as a heart type, I can sometimes either not give myself enough credit for being able to shift into mental mode, or remember the value of doing that at will, even
Yeah.
without being told, even without feedback from
Yeah.
my friends. I think similar. I think sometimes we heart types need to have a lot of cut our head type friends slack when they're learning to be more emotional,
Right.
because I think when you're anytime you're learning something that's not your default, that's more uncomfortable, that you're going to make mistakes. It's going to be challenging, and I think even if we can have that conversation in relationships, between all three of the different centers and the types in those centers, of saying, oh, I realize, having a body type say, oh, I realize I'm kind of in instinctive mode, and let me
Yeah.
shift and get and meet you in a more mental place. I think if we can even have that kind of conversation with people, that can improve relationships a lot right
I
there.
really liked all you said right now. Yeah, and I appreciated when you told me that I could just say. And at the same time, I think that many head types feel secretly incompetent of observing emotions and mainly naming them. So I think they also need help from people who are better in that, to realize that they are getting into a more uncomfortable emotional state. That's something that head types um, um, would better develop. But while they don't, it's nice to have support from others and the other person in the relationship to let them know, because as soon as some emotion comes up, the natural tendency is to start intellectualizing about it, and then we go further away from understanding it,
Yeah.
paradoxically. and welcoming it,
Right.
and then managing it.
That sounds so important for head types themselves to recognize when they're intellectualizing as a defense against feeling emotional and the discomfort that comes with that, but also the tendency to think about feelings and
Yes.
maybe think you're feeling, and that can be problematic in
Yeah.
relationships,
Yeah.
right? To be thinking about the emotion instead of actually feeling it, and
Yeah.
then the other person's kind of saying, "Well, I haven't really felt your emotion yet."
Yeah.
Now, one thing I also want to say about that is, as you were talking, what I really, in some ways, I felt like I had a new insight about is if head types are sort of more naturally in the operating at the intellectual level, having a harder time at the emotional level, well, fear is an emotion, right?
Yes. Yes.
I think that there's a way that, and this is something I think I've really misunderstood about head types generally that I'm getting clearer on, is that even though fear is quote unquote the core emotion that motivates head types in different ways, the three, they tend to not see it.
Yes.
They tend to not
Exactly.
feel it
I was
and
going to
recognize
say
it
it.
as such,
Yeah.
right? Even sixes, who we often
Yeah.
call the core fear point, because they're most centrally, I guess, driven by fear in a more direct way. They often say, and it always surprises me as emotional type, that before they learned the Enneagram, they didn't think of themselves as fearful. It's only when they learn the Enneagram and the way sixes are described and the underlying unconscious motivation that they really understand, oh, all those times I was focused on being really prepared or solving problems ahead of time, that was fear, And again, they don't call it that. And I think each of the different head types has a different kind of way of doing that.
Right.
Like sevens, especially most sevens, at the basic level of personality, before they do inner work, will say, well, they don't feel fear that much.
Yeah.
But I think heart types may more readily, even threes, say, and I hear this when I do typing interviews, when you ask about sadness, they'll often recognize there's an underlying theme of sadness. Even twos and threes who aren't so much in touch with it, or sometimes don't admit it, will often see that's there. And they're emotional types. So it makes sense that they would be more in touch with the core emotion, even if they're not always conscious of it. Whereas I'm having more compassion for my head type friends.
Thank you.
Around the fact that being driven by a core emotion, but also really not being aware of that.
Yeah, I think that you named one point here, that heart types are more capable of naming emotions and spotting them when they come up, as well as maybe head types are more capable of spotting some thoughts and ideas and work with many of them at a time. However, I also think that when there is an emotion that prevails that much, like fear for head types, it's like water for a fish. You're never out of water. So it's even difficult to just to notice there's something called water around you. And if a bird goes into the water, it's difficult. It's different. It's like they notice that there is water, right? And that's an assumption because I'm neither a bird or a fish. But I'm just trying to come up with mental type resource here, I guess, which is a metaphor to make sense of things.
And I know you've also tried on many occasions to go into resonance with fish.
Yeah. That's a whole other story for another time. And yeah, it's true. And it helped me. But another time, maybe we do a podcast on resonance. But my point is, yes, you're right. And I think it's a super important point that sometimes fear types don't see fear in particular.
Yeah. And I know recently you've said that it's only been lately that you have gotten more in touch with your own fear.
Yes.
That's a newer development for you as a five.
It was mostly being able to name fear as a very constant experience that I didn't before. But I also think that has a bit to do with the fact that I'm self-preservation repressed in my instinctual sequence,
Right.
which is yet another theme for another time.
Right. So let's talk about what's good about being in relationship with head
I'd
types.
like to hear from you.
Well, I think one thing is objectivity,
Mhm.
and I think there's and please don't, you know, remember I said this very often, but I think there's something that can be really soothing and calming to be with someone who is more objective and more calm, like
Mhm.
in a crisis, or
Mhm.
can disconnect from emotions,
Like taking
because
things a bit more lightly,
taking
perhaps.
things
Yeah.
lightly or being able to not feel a flood of emotion, say when some certain thing happens.
Mhm.
Sometimes as heart types, it's like we can't control that. It comes over us, and again, there's a wisdom in the emotion. It's not that that's a bad thing, but when I'm remembering a couple times when like something surprising happened, like a problem came up with maybe like a retreat we were going to do or something, and I was kind of really taken over by the emotion and the different emotions that came up in relation to being shocked by something going wrong. And you were able to stay more grounded and kind of just talk me down and be the voice of reason. And so I think being able to balance out being emotional with being able to step back
Mhm.
and see the bigger picture and not be taken over by a feeling that can really color things and distort things in the moment, especially when it's really strong. It's like sometimes as a heart type, I forget that I'm going to feel completely different like the next day, which is why even though I tell myself constantly, like, don't respond to an email that makes me upset or angry or irritated right away. Like, wait. I still forget that sometimes, and I make mistakes when I
Mhm.
don't allow my emotions to settle so that I can be a little bit more in equanimity and kind of see, oh, okay, there's this feeling. See the value of the feeling, but also um, have the sort of a broad view and
Mhm.
know what to do in light of it instead of
Right.
acting rashly. So I think
Yeah.
being with head types can be very comforting, and because they don't get so taken away by that feeling and get
Right.
thrown off.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And glad to know that there are at least a few things that are good in being
Of
in
course.
relationship with head types. Now,
Yes.
you talked about the big picture, and I think, I hear constantly um, people making compliments for head types about that. And it is nice for head types, coming back to that theme of what's nice for them, when people appreciate going to the big picture and get the help from the head type to contextualize problems and to understand the connection between things. And that might be an interesting thing for people in relationship with head types. I think that also embracing complexity of life and things in a way that simply honors reality. There is complexity in life. So yeah, these are a few things that I would add. But would you add anything else, or maybe talk about the bad things?
No, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about getting into trouble, especially for me being too emotional or not valuing logic enough because I'm still, getting over being told I was too emotional and too sensitive
Yeah.
as a child. But I think another really important lesson that I've learned from my head type friends is not to take things so personally. And
Right.
and again, I think probably even more so as a two, I have that tendency, but I think all heart types, especially in immediately reacting to something, um, recognizing that there is this more impersonal level. And if you go to a more mental level or a more theoretical level, you can often see that, oh, okay, this is not about me. I
Hmm.
think with the heart types, there's kind of a sense of identity. And I also think for the gut types, it can be really important for them to use the mental function and learn that from the people in their relationship with in terms of learning that it's important sometimes to think things through, either to slow down moving into action, let's say more with eights and ones, and think things through from different angles, the way head types are really good at doing. And I think for the nines, sometimes it's the opposite. They get caught in inaction or inertia. And I think sometimes going to the mental level can help them think things through in order to make decisions more quickly, get off the fence,
Yeah.
move more into action because they've allowed themselves to think through different aspects of the situation that can help them sort of
Yes.
move off that stuck place.
Yeah, that's yeah, several good points you're making. Now, I have a question for you as a very distinguished non-head type representative. A question for you to answer for the sake of our head type listeners. The question is, what do head types should know about the bad impacts they have in relationship with non-head types?
Hmm. I think sometimes it can be hard when someone goes too much to the theoretical level and doesn't take into account the personal.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't take into account, say, my individual experience of something, and especially my individual emotional experience of something, and
Mm-hmm.
or like,
It can be hurtful, can't it?
yeah, and
Yeah.
it can also feel like an avoidance,
Uh,
and then a not owning of the avoidance.
mhm.
Like I know that head types may be uncomfortable feeling emotion, and so I think sometimes there's from an analytical point of view, that judgment that
Yeah, yeah.
something based on emotion isn't as valid as something that's based on logic or information or learning or something that's more mental.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's an important thing to know. Yeah, and I do think that head types can come across as being cold at
Yes,
times
yeah,
and not caring as much as other people deserve.
right.
And sometimes being avoidant, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, in general, of anything that's not mental type territory. Um, yes, so I think there needs to be an active effort by head types to learn how to quiet the mental energy
Mm-hmm.
and to experience feelings and instincts more directly.
Yeah, yeah. I also think that um, I'm thinking more of sixes now, but I think sometimes what can be hard for me is I have the experience that sometimes sixes aren't as susceptible to my charm, and maybe fives also. Like I think
Uh,
heart types have this sense of we can shapeshift or turn on the warmth
mhm.
or express emotion as a way of connecting with people, as a
Yeah.
way of winning people over or creating a relationship. And I think sometimes some head types can be a little immune to that. There's a little bit of a, because they're not living so much in the emotional receptivity, let's say, they can stand away or apart or not be so available to that emotional appeal, let's say.
Yeah.
That, and again, I think as a two, this is part of the pride. I for a long time always had this sense of I can win anyone over, I can charm anybody. But there are some people I felt like I couldn't charm, and they were often, especially fives and sixes. I think sometimes sevens want to be charmed, whereas the fives and sixes can be a little bit more. It's like they don't fall for it as easily. And let's face it, sometimes us twos, we can, and it's funny, we can be a bit over the top or like get more on the flattering edge where it's a little bit inauthentic. Maybe it's coming from my own anxiety. I want to know you like me. And so it's less grounded and maybe a little even irritating. But I have the experience sometimes that fives and sixes, especially, that they're more in a remove, not necessarily going to be reached by an emotional appeal that I don't think of as an emotional appeal. I just think of
Yeah.
it as, in some ways being
Relating.
myself, but
Yeah.
relating.
Yeah.
Yeah, relating from more of emotion.
So I hear what you say, and I do think that may happen, but I also think that in part of the time, what's happening there is that mental types just need more time. That they are in the process. Mental types are slower in many ways.
But
So
their minds work so quickly.
well, yes, but we're not talking about their minds at work here. We are talking about them being charmed,
Mm,
and it's a much slower process.
I see.
So I don't mean to encourage type choose egos here, but what I'm saying actually is that even the charming process or allowing oneself to be charmed by someone is slower.
I see.
So, and somehow I think that you are having an expectation of that happening too quickly.
I see.
If you just wait a little bit more,
Yeah.
you might knock down a few head types with charm.
Yes, I definitely think I can be impatient to see results from my charm offensive.
Yeah, and by the way, wanting to see results too quickly with head types is something that is hard for them in relationships.
Yeah. So, any last things you want to say before we end this very illuminating conversation about head types and relationships?
I think head types are great. I think that everybody should have a head type in their lives.
Yes. Yeah.
No, I know, when it comes to relationships, I think we feel less capable and a bit incompetent. But it helped me a lot to not only understand why that was the case, and also to develop compassion for myself and other head types, as well as I developed empathy for body types and heart types.
One more thing I really want to remember to say, and I'm so glad I remembered to say this, is one of the things I love about head types, all my head type friends, this is true of, is they're very, very humorous. They often have a great sense of humor. And I'm thinking here, five, sixes, and sevens that I can think of in my life who are very quick sense of humor, very funny. And I love funny people. And it's funny because I think about you. And when I first met you, when we were on the board of directors together at the IEA in what was it, 2004 to 2009, I did not think of you as a funny person.
You probably thought of me as a boring person.
Well, boring's a little strong, but you were kind of serious.
Yeah.
And now I think you're one of the funniest people I know. So
Wow.
maybe it's just a 5 thing of it takes you a little time to warm up, but I, so many of the funniest people I've ever known in my life
Our
have been
head
head
types.
types, and
I think they're
really value
quick-witted,
that.
right?
Quick-witted, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah,
A lot
I think
of comedians, I think, even are sixes, for instance.
Yeah, I
They
agree.
often-
Yeah, stand-up comedians.
Yeah.
Yeah. Versatility, some
mental flexibility.
Yeah. If not spontaneity in itself, because that's a bit more instinctive, I guess. I think that they're flexible in the ways of thinking and so on.
Open-minded, able to think of different sides of things.
And I do think that head types can help people in their lives grow intellectually.
Yeah.
In different ways.
Yes, exactly.
I also appreciated this a lot because sometimes we need this kind of discussion to bring out all the things that we think. So that was helpful for me to name a few more things while we were recording the podcast.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Lee.
Good discussion. It's time for our top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
Our top 5 is the top 5 types who are least likely to hold themselves accountable for mistakes.
I must say this was a hard one for me to get to a conclusion myself, but I have my personal opinions now.
Okay. That's good. So, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is type 6. Um, I think that on one hand, sixes blame themselves for a lot that happens, which is not necessarily making themselves accountable, but leads sometimes to accountability. They are also very responsible and responsive. So I do think they make themselves accountable many, many times. But on the other hand, there is this thing about sixes of not owning responsibility for their own lives, which sometimes leads to not being accountable for things that they don't do in life, and going on with a project, an ambition they have, or whatever. So if we are talking about not being accountable for something they do to others, it's one thing, but accountable more in general, it's another thing. Now, I do think that sometimes sixes project and think that they haven't done things that they have done. So, yeah, so they are my number 5. What about you?
My number 5 is 5.
Oh, okay.
And I thought about this in terms of the 5 kind of defining their own view of what mistakes might be. In other
Yeah,
words, they may not be held accountable to other people's idea of what a mistake is.
right.
Also, I
Right.
think they're sensitive to being seen to not know things, and so I
Hmm.
think that can also work against being held accountable, or they just kind of broaden the scope. It's like they don't they don't adhere to other people's maybe mental models of something or
Right.
concepts, and so that can be sort of a way of kind of wriggling out of responsibility at
Yeah.
times.
I see the very same thing for fives, and I had them in my top 5, but last time I saved us fives by not having them. They went to my 6th place.
You're
Yeah. What is your 4th?
showing some favoritism.
Yeah.
So my 4th is 4. Wow, I didn't plan it this way, but
Mm.
5 is 5 and 4 is 4. In a similar way, I think 4s can sort of shift the context
Mm.
of meaning, or the way they think of things creatively. It's sort of like, well, it wasn't a mistake, and it's because you didn't understand my true intention, or
Mhm.
because I don't assign the same meaning to that you do, or you don't understand my emotions, and so you just don't understand why I did that. So it's sort of like they can shift the meaning context
Yeah.
in the same way I think 5s can sort of shift the intellectual or conceptual context to almost reframe their mistake as not really a mistake.
Yeah, I get your point. Forrest didn't make it either for my top 5, and the one that makes and is my 4th is 8, and they almost didn't make to the top 5 because I wasn't going to include them. So on one hand, I think eights make themselves accountable for everything, like being in charge and saying, let me deal with it, and if there is something bad happening, it's on me. It's a little bit on of the eight style. But on the other hand, denial, which is the main defense mechanism for them, makes them not see the impact they have on others, and that they make people feel a certain way they don't see. So I do think they sometimes don't make themselves accountable. But whenever it's more something like being accountable for something they didn't do, I think they are not bad, because they make sure that they do things and they hold others as accountable usually, and I think they do hold themselves accountable in that way. So they're not my top 3, but they are my 4th.
So my number 3 is 2. And I think 2s can have a hard time. Sometimes 2s, let's face it, they apologize too much, or they
Yeah.
take too much responsibility, or they're too quick, especially if they think they've displeased someone. I know for me, I'll really try to admit to a mistake as a way of getting back in someone's good graces. But I also think that sometimes, because of the pride, uh, they can have a really hard time owning a mistake if it
Yeah.
makes them look bad, or if it makes them feel like they've let someone down, or there can be something that's very painful about
Mm,
owning a particular mistake. So I think that, or I know for myself is sometimes I get a sense of like I'm right about something, or the way I'm seeing something is right, and it can be hard for me to give way.
mm. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and choose are also my third, for the very same reasons. And I just see sometimes that what makes it easier for choose to hold themselves accountable is when other people do that. This they
Yeah.
hold themselves accountable
Yes.
first, and that is sort of easier for the choose to negotiate with pride to do the same.
Yeah.
Like there needs to be an even thing in
Right, or
that.
it's
Yeah,
safer in some ways. It's
safer.
like,
Yeah,
okay, we're all human and we're all admitting that together.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So they are my third also.
Yeah.
My number two is seven, and I think that sevens rationalize commitment. They many times are seen as not following through with some commitment or promise they made, and they change plans or they don't do exactly what was agreed, and they not necessarily hold themselves accountable for that. I think that people see that at least in them, and many times when I did work in organizations, and when it came to this competency of accountability, problems were seen with type 7 executives on accountability. So they are my second. What is your second?
My second is also seven.
Um,
And because of everything you said, plus rationalization.
mm,
Rationalization is something sevens do a lot, which is
yeah,
finding good reasons for whatever they want to do. And so usually they can rationalize their way out of even seeing something as a mistake, and
yeah,
connected to that, reframing, right? If someone says, you made a mistake in doing this, they can reframe it as not a mistake, because they can see the positive that came from
yes,
it, for instance.
yes.
So yes,
Sevens.
sevens. And also I think there can be something negative or bad feelings connected to mistakes, admitting mistakes, and sevens can want to avoid that. It can make them feel bad, and so they can try to
Yeah.
avoid that emotional experience.
So what is your first?
My first is eight.
Wow.
Yeah, I was surprised you had it lower down. Mine is eight, because in my experience, eights are have a hard time admitting fault at times,
Hmm.
because the truth is the way whatever way they see it. It's a little bit the deniability that you mentioned, or denial, and it can have a hard time apologizing because of that, because of not sort of defining reality in their own terms, and so defining their way out of mistakes, or it can be a vulnerable experience to have the humility to admit that you made a mistake, and sometimes I think eights can avoid that experience.
Interesting. Yeah, I get your point. But my number one is a number that you didn't mention in your five, and that's type three. Why? It's because I think sometimes people mistake, um, working hard and making things happen for being accountable. And I think that while threes do a lot of the former, they don't do as much of the latter. Um, my reasoning was, unfortunately, I've seen many, many times in my career in organizational consulting, uh, threes, when something goes bad, goes wrong, threes blaming the team and not themselves. I've seen threes, I think it's so hard to face failure that there is a first reaction of looking at others to see who did that, who did anything wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in that aspect, I thought of them as my number one. But I do think that they make themselves very, very responsible for everything, and not so I'm not talking about accountability in that sense. It's just that actually, when things go wrong, I think they are one of the most avoidant of looking inside and say I did something bad.
Hmm.
It's completely uncomfortable for their personalities.
Especially if it tarnishes their image in any way. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. And I think
yes.
I think you make some good points, especially what
Mhm.
strikes me as more maybe lower awareness threes. I
Yeah.
think especially the
Yes.
case.
Yes. Yes.
I think the reason why I thought of threes for a minute and I kind of dismissed them from this list because a lot of the threes that I hear talking, especially in an organizational context, often say something like, well, just tell me what I did wrong because I want to fix it.
Yes.
That it's all
Yes.
about getting to the goal and delivering the result, and that's the priority. And so a lot of threes, in my experience, will say, tell me, give me direct feedback, and I really want to hear
Yeah.
what I'm doing wrong, and will readily admit it if it means they get to the goal. Because if
Mm.
I'm making a mistake and it's
Hmm.
getting me further away from my goal, I want to know,
Yeah.
and I'll correct it in service of moving forward and getting there.
I
So
think,
that's the what I was thinking more along the lines of, but I hear your point
and I
about
hear
image
yours.
management.
I
Yeah.
hear your points. I think you have good points. I agree with all you said about threes.
So
It's
I was
just,
right and you were wrong.
as
my
always.
my list is better than yours.
As always. Okay, so yeah, yeah, it's interesting to see how we might have at times complementary understanding of what accountability means.
Yes, exactly.
And but yeah, I appreciated seeing the differences also in our final results.
Yeah. All right. I think I was thinking it in my one-ishness in this
Yeah,
respect. I felt my one coming alive in me, my next door neighbor one, which I have a lot of because I grew up with two ones.
yeah. And
But
I thought of including ones on my five
I thought you
because
might just to be kind of
yeah,
counterintuitive. But yeah,
yeah,
I couldn't find a rational. I think most ones will
yeah.
readily
That
admit
was
mistakes.
the same conclusion I had.
Yeah, yeah. All right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for listening. Join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast where we talk about all things Enneagram.